Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Science isn't necessarily the way to people's hearts and minds and change behavior. What I've found effective is linking facts, feelings, and action. And I think those are the three ingredients that we need. We do need the facts. The facts are certainly necessary to inform wise action, to inspire the urgency with which we need to act. But facts alone aren't enough. We also need to harness the power of people's feelings in order to, as Rebecca said, link with their most important priorities and goals and values and purpose, and use the facts and what we know is effective to power and decide how we spend our time with action. And I've seen, and research also shows, that many people feel intimidated by the complexity or the perceived, difficulty of understanding the details of the climate crisis. But fortunately, all the science you need to know is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it.
Towards the end of October 2021, filmmaker and designer Jenny Pinto engaged authors and researchers Professor Kimberly Nicholas and Dr. Rebecca Huntley in a conversation on their work and their books on climate change and the shifting of the strategy of conversation around the impending climate emergency. Over to Jenny.
There is an old fable I first heard when I was a young adult. Drop a frog into a pot of boiling water and it immediately hops out. But place it into cool water and start slowly heating the pot, and the frog won't catch on, eventually getting cooked. This story came back to me last year in 2020 because it was a historic year for two reasons. One, it was a year that the world was afflicted with COVID-19, and also the second hottest year on record after 2016. People all over the world could talk about nothing else but the pandemic. No one was talking about global warming. There was, in fact, an extraordinary number of extreme weather events all over the world attributed to climate change, but nobody was discussing it much. They were mainly consumed by COVID and were willing to make drastic changes in their lives at short notice as required by COVID protocols, and governments acted very quickly and decisively for a change. This frog metaphor, as it turns out, is totally wrong about frogs, but it seems to be true of us humans. In our minds, we have normalized extreme climate events and carried on. When it comes to climate change, India is a bundle of contradictions. We are not a historic carbon emitter. Our per capita emissions are significantly lower than the global average. Yet today, India is the third largest emitter in the world, behind only the USA and China. India has maintained that it is on course to outperform its Paris Climate Agreement pledge to reduce its carbon footprint by 33 to 35% by 2030. But we have not yet set out a target year for when we will start reducing total emissions, the so-called peak emissions year. The Climate Action Tracker, an independent scientific analysis that tracks government climate action and measures it against the globally agreed Paris Agreement, rates India's efforts as highly insufficient. And although our government has set fairly ambitious renewable energy targets, more than half our GDP is singularly dependent on coal. Pollution from fossil fuel combustion is responsible for over 9 million deaths globally. India represents about 50% of that number. And there's more. In 2014, when Sri Narendra Modi took over as our PM, he renamed the Ministry of Environment and Forests as the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. But soon after, his government cut its budget by 50% and also struck down a number of laws on environmental protection and a number of environmental regulations for companies involved in mining and industrial production. Yet a recent Gallup poll showed that over 75% of Indians are satisfied with their government's performance on mitigating climate change. Is it that ubiquitous frog again? India goes to COP26 in Ireland this weekend with a lot of good promises, even while their promise to us is to keep ours a $5 trillion economy before 2024. Without fossil fuel-based energy, which the Indian government still heavily subsidizes, India's economic growth would all but come to a standstill. In short, what will help realize India's economic goals will come at the expense of its climate goals. I haven't really met many Indian climate deniers because people here, especially agriculturists and the fishing community, know the climate is changing. They experience it every day. But since we don't really talk about it, and it's not a political issue as yet, few people in India join the dots here. As a result of which, the sad reality is that climate is not an electoral priority. India's political parties don't talk about climate. Their manifestos mention it in passing. And the political system doesn't hold candidates and parties accountable for climate related issues. Even when hundreds of us perished in extreme climate related cyclones, floods, and devastating landslides in the last few years. One of the reasons for this could be that people know that fossil fuel economy delivers jobs. Nobody is sure yet about the non-fossil fuel economy. Nobody knows what it looks like. We have more urgent concerns like poverty, access to good education, gender inequality, lack of urban housing, shrinking employment opportunities, and the pandemic. These are more immediate issues for us Indians. But the irony is that these are precisely the areas that will be compounded by climate change. The impact of a 1.5 degree centigrade increase in global temperatures will, as the latest IPCC report says, disproportionately affect disadvantaged and vulnerable populations through food insecurity, higher food prices, income losses, lost livelihood opportunities, adverse health impacts, and population displacements. India stands to be one of the nations most significantly affected, given its huge population and levels of inequality and poverty. But there's a deafening silence on the subject among most of us Indians. Another irony is that ours is a country with a history of environmentalism. Way back in the early 70s, village women in what was then Uttar Pradesh came out of their homes and hugged forest trees when loggers came to chop them down. The protests that gave birth to the famous Chipko movement. And the most quoted line by Mahatma Gandhi is, "The earth has enough resources for our need, but not for our greed." He was also one of the first people who cautioned the world about the problems of large-scale industrialization, many of which we are confronting today. But today, sadly, the environment and the climate doesn't figure in conversations Indians have among themselves. That is why the books written by our two guests today are, starting with the titles themselves, very important subjects that we in India need to engage with urgently, namely, how to talk about climate change so that people will listen, and how to be human in a warming world. I'd like to welcome our guests, two esteemed authors and speakers, Dr. Kimberly Nicholas, who's written a very engaging and in many ways heartwarming book, Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World, that can be summed up in 4 exclamations. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, but we can fix it. And Dr. Rebecca Huntley, whose book, How to Talk About Climate Change So That It'll Make a Difference, gives us clues as to why we're not talking as much as we should about climate crisis, not just in India, but all over the world. As Catherine Hayhoe, a Canadian climate scientist, said, the most important thing you can do to fight climate change, talk about it. Kimberly and Rebecca, welcome to Bangalore International Center.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jenny.
How to Be Human in a Warming World and How to Talk About Climate Change, the titles themselves are a call to action for ordinary people everywhere. I really found your books very moving. Sometimes troubling, sometimes inspiring, but moving. Academically, you both come from very different fields. Kimberly is a climate scientist and Rebecca a behavioral or social scientist. But both of you in your books approach climate in a similar way. You go straight to the heart, not to the head. Enough of science, you both say very definitely. Let's get personal. Science won't save us, says Kimberly. More science isn't the solution. People are the solution, says Rebecca. Can you both expand on this? Rebecca, can you go first?
Yes, and look, sometimes when I've talked about rethinking a science-first approach to talking about climate, that's in no way saying that we shouldn't continue to educate people about why climate change is happening, or that I'm arguing for a kind of a marketing spin or a, science-free discussion. I think it comes from knowing that when we're talking about climate change and we're hoping to persuade people and make climate change relevant to them, we do really have to start the conversation at a point of connection for them. And sometimes the science isn't. I mean, I've kind of got my head around the climate science over the last couple of years because of this is where I work, but it's not something that I naturally understand. And if to start a conversation about climate, somebody put a whole lot of graphs and statistics and sciencey stuff in front of me, I'd be like, oh, I don't understand this. Maybe I'm stupid. Am I reading this wrong? I can't read that. I need to put my glasses on, that kind of thing. So I certainly think in the work that I do with the climate movement, they find that starting the conversation with the things that really matter to people, the values that they have, the goals that they have in life, and trying to find a way to connect that with action on climate, but also to show that climate change can really threaten the things that are really matter to them is and can be a much more effective way to start that conversation. The science might be embedded in that conversation somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the beginning, the launching point for a conversation on climate.
Right, very great. And Kimberly?
Well, as a scientist and a professor and teacher, of course, I believe and know that science is important and education is extremely important. But I agree with what Rebecca said, that science isn't necessarily the way to people's hearts and minds and change behavior. What I've found effective is linking facts, feelings, and action. And I think those are the three ingredients that we need. We do need the facts. The facts are certainly necessary to inform wise action, to inspire the urgency with which we need to act. But facts alone aren't enough. We also need to harness the power of people's feelings in order to, as Rebecca said, link with their most important priorities and goals and values and purpose, and use the facts and what we know is effective to power and decide how we spend our time with action. And I've seen, and research also shows, that many people feel intimidated by the complexity or the perceived, difficulty of understanding the details of the climate crisis. But fortunately, all the science you need to know is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it.
Yeah, and I mean, I even think about, I didn't do a natural science PhD, but I did a social science PhD. I understand the scientific method, and I understand that what it takes to be able to kind of get a PhD, and I know about the kinds of processes of academia. And I had been familiar with the science of climate change for a really long time. I was worried about it, but I wasn't alarmed. Like the penny didn't drop for me until I connected climate with my children. And it was really the climate strikers. It wasn't reading an IPCC report or anything that made me think my children's generation are genuinely disturbed and alarmed. So disturbed and alarmed, they're prepared to put down their smartphones and their iPads and march. And it really was, for even a very academic and very cerebral person who thinks that I approach everything kind of very rationally, it was an emotional moment that had to do with my children that made me think, 10 years, they won't have finished high school in 10 years if we've got 10 years of action. And so that was the thing that really tipped me from being academically engaged with it, so logically knew it was real, and thought, yep, that's important, government should do more, to actually becoming a climate activist. So it was an emotional moment for me, not a rational moment, even though I see myself as that kind of person, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. In fact, that was my next question. Was there a moment or an event? Because both of you actually go away from what you regularly do. Kimberly's a scientist. So to write these books, was there a moment or an event or a person that prompted you to say, this is what's important, and I'm going to write this book?
I suppose I want to know what Kimberly's. I suppose I explained mine.
Kimberly, yeah.
I think my book, Under the Sky We Make, really was born in the summer of 2017. That's when Seth Wines and I published this study on high-impact personal climate actions. And that study got a lot of media attention, which at the time was exciting, but also extremely stressful and overwhelming. But I think for me, it was the first time I had really talked with many of my friends about my work and about climate change. Before then, my research and my work life had kind of been off limits. It seemed too abstract and too far away from the things that we talked about and the activities we enjoyed together and the places we liked going. And it just was too big of a jump. But then talking about climate change in this really personal, daily, lived experience kind of way of, okay, the high impact actions that you and I can take as high emitters, which is the group that I belong to, and many of my friends as well. What really matters for us is staying on the ground, reducing car use or going car free, and cutting meat out of our diets. Those are what will reduce our own emissions here and now quickly. And those are things people understand and relate to and have opinions on and have questions about, and it's not so technical and abstract. So I think publishing this study and talking about climate change in a different way that linked more directly with people's daily lives gave me the inspiration for taking that approach in my book.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, for me, it was also, I also had a moment, but that was almost 25 years ago. And I'm not a scientist or a social scientist, and I have nothing to do with the science of it, but I'm really your average reader, actually, of both your books. And the change came to me actually 25 years ago when I became a mother. I was an ad filmmaker. I was making advertising films then. And I suddenly found this dissonance between what I was doing for a living and the way I'm trying to bring up my daughter, So, and especially because after I became a mother, I used to be asked to do a lot of films for children. Children's products, like Maggie noodles and chocolates. And I used to keep saying, okay, these are the things I'm not bringing up my daughter like this on junk food. And yet I'm doing things that are, that dissonance set in. And then that's when I started thinking about it and my interest in the environment. And I actually left, although I was doing very well, I left that industry. So it is, I think those moments, I think your children are a very strong motivation to make that change in your life. Anyway, so a question for Rebecca. 20 and 21, so unprecedented climate events. The science is not clear, and projections made even 15 years ago are happening quite fast. Faster than imagined. So why is there still a block in people's mind? Or why do we not talk about it? We're seeing it happening all around us. What is it? Is it too daunting a subject? Does it require too many changes in our lives? What stops us as people, from responding to this more quickly?
Yeah, look, it is really interesting. That adage that we see things as we are, not as they are, I think is kind of broadly very useful when we think about what happens why extreme weather events that experts that we trust say this is climate, it doesn't shift people as we imagine. Now, I wouldn't say that it doesn't shift people. It can shift people. There's in Australia, I do a long-term project called Climate Compass, which is based on an American study called Six Americas, and it kind of segments the community into groups about how they feel about climate. What we found is with things like the Black Summer fires that happened in 2019, which you probably heard about in India and the United States, in the same way that we heard about the extreme fires in Canada and Europe just, a couple of months ago. That was an event that did galvanise people who were already concerned about climate. It made them more concerned. But it only works for people who acknowledge that there is a link. For people who don't acknowledge that there's a link, there actually can be, and the research that I've done and other people have done, they dig in. They actually even they double down on their decision not to make those connections. So what we found in Australia is that there was an increase in concern amongst people who were concerned about climate change. They became very concerned. In the work that I was doing with people who were mildly concerned about climate change, but didn't think that the climate was going to impact people in the future and not today, so they didn't think it was happening now, when we said, here's a report that said by 2019 there'd be extreme fires and all the rest of it, they'd say, oh, no, that's not true. This was because there were more arsonists, or it was, it was just, they tried to find a different kind of human intervention. It was less scary that there were armies of arsonists, running through the Australian bush, burning things down, than it was fossil fuels. And I think part of that is that, there's a lot of really interesting work being done on what we what we fear and what we don't fear. People are far more fearful of a terrorist attack than they are of dying of cancer for smoking or getting in their car and driving somewhere, even though statistically we know that they're much more likely to die from a car accident than a terrorist attack. So we don't really look at our fears rationally. That means that we have to find different avenues to persuade people, because I have found that for people who resist the links between climate and climate change and what's happening today, they will really shut off. They just won't engage. And so you've got to find another way around having that conversation with people. It can be very frustrating, but we don't have a lot of time to change everybody's opinion about the connection between extreme weather events and climate change. We've got 10 years. So I'm all for trying different techniques.
Yeah, that's a segue into my next question, which again, Rebecca, you talk about. I mean, so when you say communication, people are not making the connection. In the book, you talk about an information deficit model of communication.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to science, one-way communication, the jargon, the technical language, and that science communication ignores the fact that we're dealing with human beings. So, like the Norwegian psychologist, I think who you quote a lot, Stocknes, is that his name? Stocknes, yeah. Calls the greatest science communication failure. Kim, how do you respond to that as a climate scientist, actually?
Pretty fair. I think the criticism is pretty fair. I mean, we're often taught traditionally that students are empty buckets that we're trying to fill with the correct information, and that's just not how human beings work or how people learn. At the same time, so that's the information deficit model, that, people just don't have the right, correct, true facts. And if they had the facts, those facts would then automatically translate into action, policy change, behavior change, collective action. And that's just not correct. But at the same time, as we said earlier, we know that we do need a solid basis of facts. And even in this disturbingly post-truth world, research shows quite solidly that people actually do trust scientists, do value expertise, do want to hear from researchers and topic experts. And so it is really important for scientists to continue to speak out and share their knowledge, but also to collaborate with others and to do so in a way that is effective in reaching people.
And on that issue around facts, I mean, for the book, I interviewed a range of climate activists from around the world, and also looked at the impacts of, for example, integrated climate science in curriculum at high schools. And it is quite clear that there's a couple of activists in places like Fiji and also Australia, but also the Philippines, who'd had school children had gone and learnt about climate change at school. It's now compulsory in Italy, climate science. And then they'd gone back to their communities and observed in their communities that climate was. So they made that connection between the information that they received at school and lived experience. Or they'd had a grandparent say, we used to fish here, but now we can't anymore. And it was actually that profound combination between lived experience and curriculum and information at school that really turned them into a climate activist. And I think that is what's powerful, not we shouldn't have information or that we shouldn't have science, but it's the integration of that scientific knowledge with lived experience and relevance and the stories of the community around you that's actually going to be the most powerful.
Absolutely. Actually, I had a question later on, but I think it sort of fits in here now about our education system. I mean, what role does education itself play in how we respond to the planet we live in? You know, I mean, this whole, we study everything in subjects, and I find especially, I've spoken to students here, and they don't connect the biology with the geography or the chemistry, you know, I mean, that disconnect and to understand how, climate impacts absolutely every area of our lives. So is there a lot of unlearning that we have to do? Is it the fault of our education system? Do we need to learn new ways of seeing, integrating experience and knowledge, find new tools? No, and to what Kim calls the exploitation mindset to regenerative mindset. I mean, that has to start with our education system. We need to embed, a systems way of thinking, for instance, in our education. Would you agree?
I'll go to Kim on that.
Yeah, Kimberly?
Education has an absolutely critical role in basically this decade that we're in right now is a race between two tipping points. There are a series of terrible, catastrophic climate and ecological tipping points like ice sheet disintegration that we absolutely don't want to cross. Sorry, Rebecca, I see you.
No. Every time I try not to think about the permafrost and any of those kinds of things. That's how I keep it even. You would understand. I try and
That's
keep it
another
even.
one. So, I mean, these are the terrible things we're trying to avoid, and this is what's at stake. Those are the tipping points we don't want to reach. The positive social tipping points that we do want to reach are galvanizing enough people who are concerned or alarmed already about the climate crisis. And that's the group that I focus on, because that actually is the majority in countries even like the US and more so around the world. People already do care and are concerned. And what I focus on doing is empowering people to link that concern to action in a meaningful way. So education is definitely critical there. And some of my research has been on the state of climate education and what we found, for example, in the US, Europe, Australia as well. Governments and schools are not giving accurate information in terms of focusing on the high impact climate actions. And that was why we did this 2017 study that I mentioned, that my colleague Seth, who was the lead author, used to be a high school teacher. And he constantly got the question from students, what can I do? What are the things that I personally, as a teenager, have the power to do that make a difference? And oftentimes people are interested in starting in their own lives and their own lifestyle and things that they have decision-making control over. So that's where we compiled all these studies to compare apples to apples and came up with going car, flight, and meat-free, or focusing on those areas for reducing overconsumption as making a big difference. We've since expanded that model to include actions like voting, protesting, engaging as a citizen, as part of organizations. I mean, there are many ways that people can effectively engage. But absolutely, we need accurate education. And that is one of those leverage points that can help us reach that good social tipping point where we actually transform from exploitation, dangerous fossil fuel use, to regeneration, care for people and nature. Education is definitely key to making that happen.
I do a lot of work with all kinds of organisations, whether they be public or private or government. And one of the things our research shows, and actually research around the world, is that Kimberly's right. Like, the majority of all citizens of a lot of countries are concerned or alarmed. But if you cut that data by people under 30, you start to get even more concerned or alarmed. So, for example, in Australia, if you just analyse people under 30, only 1% of them would be described as climate deniers and 60% would be described as quite alarmed on climate. So I always say to any organisation, you've got a wave of consumers, students, patients, voters, you name it, whatever kind of, persona that we take in our lives, citizens of any kind, who are going to be asking you these questions, whether you want them to be asked or not. So, and in education, you're going to be getting a whole lot of people who want to do all kinds of different degrees or all kinds of different professions and train for them, and climate and environment and sustainability be central to that. So systems have to change because that change will be demanded. I mean, we don't want to have to wait for everybody under 25 to grow up, and we've got a responsibility to them now to change the system, but they will force the kinds of changes on the system just by the level of their anxiety around these questions, and they're not going to kind of grow out of them as often sometimes some leaders say, oh, that's just young people care about things. No, do you know why? Because as they grow up, the climate will get worse. Mother Nature isn't going to let them, forget this issue or us. So I think that, back to that issue of education, they're going to demand a mainstreaming of sustainability and climate issues throughout the education system, not just post-compulsory education, but also primary and high school education.
That's a good thing if it's happening in the USA and Australia. It's not, I'm not finding that happening here much yet. I think it's because we're not talking about it, not enough to our children, not enough to each other. But having said that,
Rebecca, you write that about in your book about the green girls, what you call the green girls. And you talked about this Daisy Jeffrey in Australia, but we have our own equivalents of Greta Thunberg here as well, though they haven't become that famous. And we in Bangalore we had this 22-year-old girl called Disha Ravi, and there's a girl from one of the northeast states in India called Lissy Priya, who's an 11-year-old who addressed the UN in 2019. And then, so what is it about girls? I mean, why do you think girls are better at this?
It's pretty amazing. And in fact, a lot of First Nations communities around the world also have really extraordinary young girl advocates around things around climate, including issues like water, First Nation rights over land. It is pretty amazing. I mean, some of it is a bit cyclical, so girls will see that other girls in other countries are speaking out, and that will give them some role model work. I mean, I can only really talk about the combination of things coming together, kind of like elements coming together in places like Australia and with some of the studies I've looked at. I think what we've seen in Australia is a gravitation of young women to STEM subjects. It used to be that science and all of those other kinds of things were things that girls didn't do. So there's been a quite, just in one generation, quite a big change there. So they're being exposed to science. They're also being encouraged to be leaders, to be more outspoken for a whole range of reasons. And they're just really, really good. They're just really good at mobilising the tools of their peer groups, of social media. I mean, there's always been in the social science data a little bit of a gender skew. Women tend to be a bit more concerned about things. They've always been, for example, were much more concerned about things like nuclear disarmament. They were much more concerned around issues around world peace. They've always been a bit more supportive of environmental protection, a bit more focused on health. And when we look at the data as well, the people, if we look at people who are really, really concerned around climate, there are more women than men. I don't want to overemphasize those differences because they're not some of the most decisive differences in the community. So there's a bit of a gender thing there as well. I think it's great. I think it's good. They're really, really talented at it. But I would hate for it also to be, the thing that concerns me too is that I would hate for this to be characterised by, for the fact that they are young women, for them to be, for this, their concern to be dismissed as just a kind of, a mean girls, immature girls kind of on social media worried about something and being able to kind of slag off at adults. So I think there can be a trivialisation around it, which is really problematic. I think what's more important is while spokespeople are critically important for the environment movement, they can also hamper and obscure the fact that people of the diversity of people who are concerned around climate and acting on climate now is just staggering. So to characterise it as something that women are more concerned about or younger people are more concerned about, while the data shows that the actual thing is the majority of people are really concerned, and you can pick any variable and there is somebody who personifies that is really, they're there. So that's the thing. We want to focus on the diversity in the community rather than individuals.
Yeah, but in traditional communities, in India, among the agricultural communities, and I remember listening to actually a Native American leader speak. I heard something on YouTube recently, where they also say that among their communities, and it is true here in India as well, that lots of the women are more practical about work, about solutions to, say, water problems or soil degradation. They're more concerned and they come up with solutions. So I think somewhere maybe there is an empathy that comes more naturally to women. Maybe that's one of the reasons. I'm not haven't seen studies on this, but just on anecdotal, from people who are actually working with communities, agricultural communities in India, and they say that the women are much more involved when it comes to solutions on climate-related.
I just was going to add two things. One, gender equality is important in its own right and also a climate solution. So studies have shown, for example, that when the number of women in parliament increases, carbon pollution goes down. So increasing gender equality is important, having rights and education and equality in society is the kind of world I want to live in, and also helps activate and bring about climate solutions. And secondly, something I think is interesting and important, and you mentioned this briefly in your book as well, Rebecca, that basically the opposite of essentially another manifestation of equality where we see that it's really important is on the reverse. So in other words, a very strong driver of those small minority, less than 10%, who actually deny the reality of human-caused climate warming. That is a very strongly anti-feminist and anti-egalitarian group. So the people who are most entrenched in a very hierarchical worldview where some people are superior to others and where people in general are superior to nature, that's the exploitation mindset, and that is the driver of resisting climate solutions, basically, and even climate facts.
No, I think that's right. And we've seen there's a bit of a kind of an overlap between people who, for example, think that we should just let COVID-19 rip through the community and not have lockdowns and not have masks and all the rest of it because, it infringes my freedom. So that sense of the connection between the individual well-being and community well-being, which I think for whatever reason is either something that is more accessible or encouraged in women, that kind of connection, rather than that kind of go it alone, no matter what kind of ethos, which is very much in Australia. Like when I think about hardcore climate deniers and people who think COVID-19 is a conspiracy to stop them being able to go to the pub and have a beer. There's a very, very strong older white man skew in Australia. Very, very much so. So there's, masters of the universe kind of mentality. Yeah. So I think there's a complex politics, gender politics and identity politics playing a role there.
And in developing countries like ours, the women are actually more impacted by climate change. I mean, in our villages, it's them who go out, who have to walk further for water. They have to find food for their families, So, I think gender, of course, it does come into the entire climate discussion very strongly, especially in countries like ours.
And one of the things that and please correct me if I'm wrong, Jenny, in countries like India, there are a lot more women who are sole farmers in the agricultural industry, running smaller farming their own land, and they're finding it harder.
Yeah, there are lots of women who are, but even if it's a family-run farm, the women actually put in a lot of work. And in addition, they have to find water. Some of them walk long distances for water, and they're having to do that to walk longer and longer distances now because
Yeah, working harder for less in terms of the yield of their land. Absolutely.
So let's actually talk about the developed countries. I mean, Kimberly, you have a passage in your introduction actually, which says the climate especially hangs on what Americans do in the next decade. And you want to say it's acutely clear how much the climate hinges on what happens in the world's largest economy and the largest historical climate polluter. And then a few lines down, you say there's a deeper cultural element too. For generations, the world has aspired to an American model of consumption that is widening inequality, making us sick and unhappy, and destroying the workings and wonders of the natural world. When I read that, it actually brought to mind something I'd read a while ago, an article written by a Nobel Peace Prize winning economist Mona Singh, who's a Sri Lankan. And he talks about enlightened self-interest as a key to reducing consumption. He had, in fact, an agenda known as the Millennium Consumption Goals. And he said, and I quote, "If you look at the structure of consumption and production, you will find that the top 20% of the global population, which is 1.4 billion people, are responsible for 85% of consumption. So in a nutshell, we are saying these are the people who are putting the greatest burden on the world's resources and are causing the problem. Therefore, instead of looking at the rich as a problem, let us see them as part of the solution. If we can reach them and through voluntary mechanisms, make their consumption more sustainable, we can reduce the burden on carbon emissions. And he called that enlightened self-interest. Do you think that's too idealistic, Kimberly?
It is not the only solution, but I think it's a very important solution. And that is a lot of the work that I do as a member of this privileged group. I mean, the more recent data shows that it's actually only 10% of the top earners. And that's people who earn over about $38,000 a year US. So in countries like the US and in much of Europe, that is below the median income. So the majority of people in countries like Germany and Sweden fall in that group. And we are the group, and I'm a part of that group as well, that has caused about half of household climate pollution. So I think both practically as a major emitter and also morally as really taking responsibility for the harm that we have caused, or that the systems we're a part of and have supported have caused, we really have to be out front and leading. And an important point is that this doesn't let governments and businesses off the hook for taking their own responsibility. It's true at every level. So the more power and privilege and pollution you have, the stronger your own responsibility to act. And while we can also act as citizens and as consumers and as investors and in other ways to put pressure on making those system changes, we also really have to go first and lead by example. And I think the UN climate negotiations that are starting in a few days, a lot of what happens there is really hinged on this conflict that historically low emitters like India argue, I think very compellingly and correctly, that rich countries who've caused most of the problem need to go first and fastest in making the solutions happen and in making them more affordable and in supporting the rest of the world in adopting them. And I think that's really the key to unlocking large-scale climate action. And it's a mirror of what needs to happen on a personal level as well.
I totally agree. And let's also let's really think about the kind of sacrifices. Well, let's rethink what sacrifice means here for people like Kimberly and I. If I just never ate beef for the rest of my life and focused on eating a small amount of, sustainably made chicken and other kinds of things, it'd be a huge impact if all of my community did that. We're not going to starve. My children are not going to be malnourished because I'm wealthy and I live in a wealthy country with an abundance of resources. If I drive less, right, I can get, I can walk to places safely. I can get to, I work from home. If I fly less, maybe I've been to Disneyland twice in my life. Maybe I will not go again. We're really talking about there's so much capacity for quote unquote sacrifice for us for a payoff that is extraordinary if it's done at a certain level. So if that is available to you while still maintaining security, safety, a decent standard of living, then you can do it. I understand why other people think that somehow, lecturing them or somehow woke. You don't really have to. You just do it. You just do it. I think you have to and the moral obligation is important, as well as we know through the economic modelling the impact that would have. So, for example, in Australia, and we are at we are the top of, in the top 5 countries clearing land. We clear basically 2 football fields of trees every hour in Australia. It just keeps going. We've got a very, very bad record. 73% of all land clearing in Australia is for beef. It's for beef production. So I'm not even telling everybody to go vegan. I'm saying that there are ways that you can modify the things that you do without genuinely compromising your standard of living and the standard of living for your children and your happiness and your joy, and have a real impact when it comes to climate.
So is this part of public discussions in both your countries, actually, in America and in Australia? I mean, are people discussing this, talking about it? Because eventually it does boil down to consumption, and that has to come down. So, I mean, how do people respond to that?
Well, look, it also boils down to structural change, which makes consumption easier for people. Look, it is a topic of conversation in Australia for all the wrong reasons, because Australia is, while our domestic emissions aren't great, we are one of the biggest exporters of coal and gas to the rest of the world. So we just export our emissions to other countries. We're also an embarrassing blocker of climate action around the world. We have extreme climate effects in Australia affecting our most vulnerable, so our Indigenous communities away from the coast who are having issues around water, as well as the Torres Strait Islander people whose literally islands are being swallowed by climate change. And we have enormous opportunities to begin to be part of the renewable energy economy and start to really make that shift. And we could be doing a lot to help the entire region that we're in move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And climate politics in Australia gets talked about a lot because it's been used as a political football in this country for a long time. So it is talked about. It's talked about a lot in the media. People talk about it, but it's not always been a productive conversation. But things are changing. It'll be interesting. Our federal government is enormously isolated at the global level because of their consistent delay, first of all, denialism and now delayism. And they're increasingly being attacked by the community who just want this issue solved. It's been it's been a political running sore for the last 15 years. So it does get talked about, not always in the most productive ways, but at least it's on the agenda.
Kimberly, do you want to add something to that?
So to stop climate change, we have to do two things. First, we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground and switch to clean and renewable energy. That will solve about 75% of the problem. Second, we have to switch from destructive and industrialized food production and agriculture to sustainable and regenerative agriculture. That's the remaining quarter of climate pollution is our land use. So in order to make those things happen, for 90% of the world, we have to make structural changes, policy changes that make it expensive and eventually impossible to burn fossil fuels and help incentivize the transitions to sustainable agriculture. For the 10% of us who are the highest consumers, we have to address our own personal consumption as well. And that is critical to making those transitions happen, to basically reducing energy demand from very excessive consumption. I mean, the top 10% are about 10 times too high in our personal emissions compared with the sustainable level, which India is quite close to per capita, actually. And the top 1% are 30 times too high in their emissions. So technical and social, political changes are not going to be enough. That group also has to reduce overconsumption. Whereas the challenge for a country like India is to meet the needs of all their citizens to, for example, provide electricity to the 400 million people who don't have it today, while avoiding a huge increase in emissions.
Yeah, exactly. Just this morning, actually, I read UNEP had a press release last week about the production gap between what was agreed for the Paris Agreement. And it says that most of the world's governments plan to produce around 110% more fossil fuels in 2030. That will, and 110% of what would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And all three of our countries, USA, Australia, and India, are part of the 15 top producers who continue to provide significant policy support for fossil fuel production. So I was very, very disturbed when I read that, actually. I said, I don't know where we're going.
So I spent almost all of my time doing focus groups of Australians get to understand how they feel about climate and renewable energy. And last night I was doing a focus group around a region of Australia which has been built entirely from fossil fuels called Gladstone in Queensland. Mainly coal. No one lives in that place who hasn't worked in the coal industry or doesn't have friends who work in the coal industry. And we were talking about COP and we were talking about renewable energy, and this is a community that knows that things have to change. Do they have a lot of faith that the government will support them through that change? No, but they're not naive, they're not stupid, they're not, as one young man said, we're not in love with coal, we're in love with waking up in the morning to go to a job, to come home and put food on the table for our families. That's what we're in love with. And, the wisdom and reflection of that group was quite amazing, and they really wanted to believe in a world where climate change could be mitigated, where the green spaces and native animals of Australia would be protected, where there wouldn't be, hot summer after hot summer. Jenny, where we'd be able to play the Indians in Test cricket and win without, because Test cricket, very important to you, very important to us. And, when I do those kinds of groups, I realise that even in a community, that coal is absolutely central to their affluence and central to their identity, has been central to identity. They want the change. And this is where government becomes so critically important. And at the end of that conversation, there was a woman who was a school teacher who said, we're talking just about what their hopes were for the community. And she said, all of the kids that I teach, their parents work in and around the coal industry, and I want them to have jobs because I want my kids, the kids that I teach to go home to happy families that are, don't have to worry about paying the rent. She said, but also all of my kids worry about the environment and climate change, and I worry about the world that we're leaving them. And we've got to can't we find a way to do both things? And so while I get very frustrated with our leaders, I'm continuously inspired by listening to quote unquote everyday Australians who really largely know this is happening and want something and want to see progress in, sooner rather than later. And, it's a privilege to listen to them and try and be a megaphone for their views for the decision makers in Australia. Our government will go to COP next week with Kimberly's government, who's a lot better than they used to be, and Jenny's government, who has a whole lot of other different challenges to try and sort this problem out. So hopefully it will happen.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you too. And lovely to meet you, Kimberly. I've ordered your book, but everything is taking a very, very long time to get to Australia at the moment.
Understood. Well, thank you for all you're doing. Really nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Okay, see you guys. Bye.
Kimberly, would you like to read a passage from your book that you'd like to leave us with?
I think what Rebecca just said is so important, that we have to focus on climate justice. And to me, part of climate justice is those with the most responsibility and power to act accept that responsibility and use our agency to actually put into practice in our own lives and push on the systems that we're a part of to make climate action happen, to leave fossil fuels in the ground, to switch to healthy, sustainable, regenerative agriculture. It's also really important that we engage and provide for the workers in the industries that the climate just cannot afford anymore. So it's essential that coal miners still have jobs in a world where we don't burn coal anymore. And there are good examples, like Spain, for example, has a Ministry of Ecological Transition. In Canada, there are oil field workers who are coming together to demand training in clean energy so that they can help be part of replacing dangerous fossil energy with clean solar panels, for example. So I think that is really essential, and that's part of an initiative I support, which is called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's modeled after the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And it's basically about how do we wind down fast, fairly, and forever fossil fuel production and consumption. And a critical pillar of that is providing a just transition for the workers in those industries. So I just wanted to say that. And yeah, I'd be happy to read something from my book. So this is from chapter 13 of Under the Sky We Make. It's the chapter is called Being a Good Ancestor, Building the Climate Cathedral. What is humanly possible? Climate change is perhaps the most enormous opportunity to test our humanity. Preventing climate breakdown is at the absolute outer limits of what we might just be capable of. It requires us to rewrite our ideas of who we are, the language and concepts and traditions we use to braid our identities and cultures together. It requires us to redefine and then remake what is humanly possible, what humans are capable of making possible. I am convinced that now is the most interesting time to be alive. Whether by divine plan or blind chance, it is each and every one of us alive today who happen to be the cast for a decisive moment in human history. Like all generations before us, the impacts of our decisions stretch across space and time in ways we cannot fathom. But we have an unprecedented level of power. Our decisions affect not only ourselves and our families, not only human civilization around the world today and for millennia to come, but the very preconditions for human civilization. Whether, when, and how much rain falls, if crops ripen or wither and die. Climate stabilization is our generation's cathedral to build. Instead of bricks and mortar, our cathedral must be built from life itself, harnessing regeneration to leave a thriving, living world and a good life for ourselves and for future generations as the mark of our time on Earth. We need cathedral thinking to stop climate change, collectively working toward a transcendent purpose we may or may not live to see accomplished, but that will outlive us all.
Wonderful. You know, when I read your book, I read that 3 times actually. I found that really moving. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kimberly. It was a pleasure and an honor having you with us, talking about your books. It was really an interesting conversation that we had. And it's really nice to know actually that somewhere, you know, different countries, I mean, we come from the other side of the world, but we're all in the same boat now. So it's good that there are people in all countries everywhere that are thinking along these lines. And I want to sign out actually of this podcast with a quote from Matthew King. He's a writer and a futurist. And this quote has always resonated with me. He says, "It's true that no other species has evolved to create such a large-scale problem, but no other species has evolved with such an extraordinary capacity to solve it either." And I hope he's right. And I hope that, you know, we'll all be around happy and happy with us, with what we've done 15 years from now. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for having me. And thanks to Rebecca.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.